25th. The man who is always hesitating which of the two things he will do first will do neither. The man who resolves but allows his resolution to be changed by the counter suggestions of a friend who changes from opinion to opinion, from plan to plan, and turns like a weathercock to every point of compass with every breath, can never accomplish anything great or useful. It is only the man who first consults wisely, then resolves firmly, and then executes the purpose with perseverance in the face of whatever difficulties may come in the way, that can advance in any line. Take your course wisely but firmly, and having taken it, hold to it with resolution, and the Alps and the Himalayas will sink before you. Question: what does a man always hesitate, behave and fare in life? How does a man always hesitating behave and fare in life? B. What kind of people succeed in life? C. What is the author's advice to the young? 26. The people of a certain district in Italy were much surprised at the fine appearance and great fertility of a farm belonging to one amongst them named Zrisin. As their own lands were poor and barren, they conceived that Cresin must have employed some magical arts in order to make his ground produce such abundance. Accordingly, they brought him before a judge and accused him of having an enchanter. Zrisin called upon his defense, brought forward a stout girl, his daughter, and also his tools of husbandry and the cattle which drew his plough. The girl, said he, pulls up the weeds that grow on my farm. I manure it carefully to enable the ground to bear good crops. Page 694. You see that all my implements are in the best order, and that my cattle, which I take pains to feed well, are the stoutest in the country. Here is all the magic I use in the management of my farm, and any one of my neighbors may have a good crop as I, if he will use the same means. The judge said he had never heard better pleading, and acquitted Cresin with many words of praise for his industry. Question: what was the difference between the farm of Cresin and that of any other man? B. What was the charge against Cresin, and what was the reason for it? C. What was the defense of Cresin? D. What was the decision of the judge? 27th. About the 6th century BC, Takshila was the chief center of learning in India. It was 20 miles north-west of Rawalpindi. Students from various parts of India and from foreign countries flocked to its famous university for higher education. It is said that 16 different subjects were taught in the university, each under the charge of a renowned professor who was specialist in his subject. The fame of Takshila continued until Alexander the Great invaded India in 326 BC. We learn that the city was then very wealthy and well governed. Under Ashoka the Great, we find it still the chief seat of learning. A famous historian, when describing the condition of India under Ashoka, says, "The sons of the people of the upper classes, chiefs, Brahmins, merchants, flocked to Takshila as to a university town in order to study the circle of Indian arts and sciences." But Takshila evil days began soon after. It fell a prey to the invading forces of Greeks, the Sakas, the Parthians, the Kushanas in turn. Lastly, the Huns gave Takshila its death blow. When Hansen visited it in 7th century AD, he found it in ruins. Questions: what and where was Takshila? What was its condition before Ashoka the Great? What was the condition during the time of Ashoka? D. When did its evil days begin? E. How was its fall brought about? 28. On the 10th November 1863, a railway train was carrying Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States of America, to a place called Gettysburg, where he was going to speak at a meeting. Had you been there, you would have found him busy writing something on the back of an envelope. It was what he was going to say at the meeting. The speech, now famous as the Gettysburg Address, is one of the shortest yet the finest in the English language. The last words of the speech are, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth." These words tell us what the best possible way of ruling a country is. It is always better for the people to manage their affairs for their common good than to leave them in the hands of a single person or a small group of persons. Now, what is good for the persons is also good for nations. For their own sake, nations should come together to look after their common interests, which are the common interest of mankind. That is what the United Nations want them to do. Questions. Who was Abraham Lincoln? B. What was the Gettysburg Address? C. When and where was it written? D. What were its last words? E. What is the meaning of these words? F. How do they apply to nations? G. What is the aim of the United Nations? 29th. Up to the middle of the 18th century, the methods of producing goods in Europe were much the same as they are in a large number of Indian villages today. Everything was done by the hand, and any machine that were employed for the making of goods were rough and crude and were also worked by hand. But the invention of the steam engine and steam-driven machinery changed everything. Hand powder gave place to machine powder, and so man was able to manufacture goods in large quantities with the help of machines. While in old times a single piece of woolen or cotton cloth required the labor of many spinners and weavers for a large number of days, it was now possible to produce the same type and length of cloth much more cheaper in a mill in a few hours with the help of a few workers. All this brought about a great change in the industries of Europe and in many ways changed the entire life of European countries. Questions. A. What were the methods of producing goods in Europe up to the middle of the 18th century? D. What changes came after that time? C. How did these changes develop industry? D. What were their effect upon European life? 30th. Page 695. In India, every boy and every girl now reading in schools is the future citizen of the country. Although he or she is not immediately called upon to vote or to make laws, he or she will have to do this in the near future. As the citizen of tomorrow, every young man should therefore prepare himself for this great task from now on. The young citizen's first duty is to learn how not to hurt others, to be careful not to play unfairly in the playing field, and not to speak a word which may give pain to anyone, not to make fun of others or say things behind one's back. He should not waste or throw away a grain of food, considering that there are many poor people in India who do not have enough to eat. Lastly, he should get training on the use of leisure. Question. What is the great task of a citizen? B. Who are the future citizens of the country? C. How are they to prepare themselves for their task? D. Why should they be careful against waste of food? 31st. One of the less fortunate results of the large amount of matter which the printing press turns out in our time is the tendency it has bred to read everything hastily and unthinkably. The man who glances through several newspapers in the morning and 2 or 3 magazines in the evening forms the habit of inattention, or more correctly, half attention. He reads with no intention of remembering anything except what directly and urgently bears upon his own business, and where in the scanty leisure which business and the practice of reading newspaper and magazines leave him, he takes up a book. His habit of half attention prevents him from applying his mind to what he reads. Instead of stimulating thought, constant reading of this kind deadens it, and quantity of reading and the quantity of thinking are apt to be in inverse ratio to one another. Questions. Why do people nowadays read everything hastily? B. Why does a modern man fail to apply his mind to what he reads? C. What is the result of this half attention? 32. When we come down from the summit, there was much foolish talk about who got there first. Some said it was I, Tenzing, some Hillary. Some say that only one of us got there, or neither. Still others that one of us had to drag the other up. To put a stop to such talk, Hillary and I signed a statement in which we said we reached the summit almost together. Mountaineers understand that when 2 men are on the same rope, they are together. But other people do not understand and keep on asking questions. This has caused so much talk and doubt and misunderstanding that I feel the answer should be given. It is not for my own sake that I gave it, nor it is for Hillary's. It is for the prestige of Everest and for the generations who will come after us. Why, they will say, should there be a mystery to this thing? Why can we not know the truth? Very well, now they will know the truth. Everest is too great for anything but the truth. A little below the summit, Hillary and I stopped. We looked up, then we went on. The rope that joined us was 30 feet long, but I held most of it in loops in my hand, so that there was only 6 feet between us. I was not thinking of first and second. We went on slowly, steadily, and then we were there. Hillary stepped on first, and I stepped up after him. Question. What was the talk when the climbers came down? B. What did they do to stop it? C. Why did people go on asking? D. Why does Tenzing now give out the truth? E. What is the truth? 33. One of the most valuable treasures on earth is common salt. But it can be found almost everywhere. All boys and girls know that sea water is salt. It is salt because there is salt in the soil. As rivers cut their way through the soil, they dissolve the salt and carry it down to the sea. Imagine what a vast amount of salt must be taken to the sea in this way every year. Much of the sea salt evaporates, but the salt is left behind. In some places, great salt lakes have been dried up, leaving behind quantities of salt, and people are engaged in gathering this together for sale. In other places, salt is found beneath the surface of the ground, just as we find coal. Today, salt is cheap because it is plentiful. Many years ago, however, it was expensive. In some places, it was so valuable that people gave salt when they wished to make someone a splendid present. Question. Why is sea water salt? B. What are the different sources of our supply of salt? C. Was salt always cheap? 34. Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikh religion, was born in the Punjab in the second half of the 15th century. He was sent to school early and even at that age gave proof of a religious turn of mind. His father, anxious to draw him away from his spiritual thoughts, sent him to look after the cultivation of his fields. But the young man had no inclination for this kind of work. He began to show more and more interest in religious matters. He was married, but marriage did not divert him from his life of prayers. Page 696. For some time he was in the employ of the government, but he was not happy until he gave up his job and lived as a fakir in the forest. At this time he composed the holy songs which are now preserved in the Granth Sahib, the sacred book of the Sikhs. He then went from one place to another, preaching his doctrine and making disciples. Towards the close of his life, Nanak gave up the life of a fakir and settled down at Kharatpur, Kharatpur, Kharatpur. A large number of followers gathered round him there. To them he preached his new religion and taught them to live righteously and peacefully and to love one another. He died in 1538. Questions. Who is Guru Nanak? B. Give an account of his early life. C. Give an account of his life as a fakir. D. Give an account of his life towards the close. E. What is the Granth Sahib? 35. Socrates was born of poor working class parents, probably in the year 470 BC. He had the usual education of boys in those days, learning music, science, philosophy and gymnastics. He also studied the arts of public speaking and argument. As a young man he served the army and fought in several battles with great courage. When he left the army, some of his friends wanted him to go into politics, but this he refused to do, for he felt that he had another mission in life. This mission was to unmask ignorance and encourage truth. Up and down the streets of Athens, in the marketplace and temples, in the houses of the rich and the workshops of the poor, Socrates carried on his search for truth. His method was to stop someone and begin to question him. By his questions he would show the other man how vague and incomplete his ideas were. Then he would help him to build up his ideas on a surer foundation. Questions. What were the parents of Socrates? B. What education did he have? C. What was the advice his friends gave him? D. Did he follow that advice? If not, why not? E. What was the method followed by him in fulfilling his mission? 36. Machinery has come to stay, but it must not be allowed to displace necessary human labor. An improved plough is a good thing, but if by some chance one man could plough up by some mechanical invention the whole of the land of India and control all the agricultural produce, and if the millions had not other occupation, they would starve, and being idle they would become dunsen. I would welcome every improvement in the cottage machine. What I object to is the craze for machinery. Men go on saving labor till thousands are without work and thrown on streets to die of starvation. I want to save time and labor, not for a fraction of mankind, but for all. I want wealth not in the hands of a few, but in the hands of all. Today, machinery helps a few to ride on the back of millions. The impetus behind it all is not the philanthropy to save labor but greed. M.K. Gandhi. Why does Gandhiji object to the introduction of machinery on a large scale? B. What exception is he prepared to make and why? C. What is the motive according to Gandhiji behind the craze for machinery? 37. There have been ascetics at all times and in all countries, but they have always been particularly numerous in India. They are people who believe that power and holiness may be obtained by making one's body uncomfortable, as for example by not eating or sleeping and by beating oneself. But after a time Buddha turned from these ideas. Having come to see that the way to discover truth is not to have a weak or diseased body, he horrified his companions by demanding food. Accordingly, they cast him out as a failure, and for a time he wandered alone. We know nothing of his wanderings, but presently we find him sitting at Gaya under an enormous big tree called the Bo tree. Here he had a kind of vision, and his vision resulted in the first great teaching about good and right which was given to mankind. Question. What do the ascetics generally believe? B. Why was Buddha cast out by his followers? C. How did he discover the truth? 38. It was very difficult to make our people observe rules of sanitation, but my Mahatma Gandhi's but my co-workers lightened my task. It has been my constant experience that much can be done if the leader becomes the chief servant and actually serves and does not dictate to the people. If he puts in bodily labor himself, others will follow him. At least such was my experience on the present occasion. My co-workers and I never hesitated to do sweeping, scavenging, cleaning the streets, and similar work, with the result that others also took it up enthusiastically. If one will not bend one's back to the work, it is no good issuing orders. All would assume leadership and dictate to others, and there would be nothing done in the end. But where the leader himself becomes a servant, there are no rival claimants for leadership. Page 697. Questions. What was the experience of Mahatma Gandhi? How did he make his people observe the rules of sanitation? C. What, according to him, are the qualifications for leadership? 39. The human race is spread all over the world. The people of whom it is made up eat different kinds of food, partly according to the climate in which they live, and partly according to the kind of food which the country produces. Thus, in India, the people live chiefly on different kinds of grain, eggs, milk, or sometimes meat and fish. In Europe, people eat more flesh and less grain. In the Arctic regions, where no grain and fruits are produced, the Eskimo and other races live almost on flesh, especially fat. The men of one race are able to eat the food of another if they are brought into the country inhabited by the latter, but as a rule they still prefer their own food, owing to custom. In hot climates, fat and flesh are not much needed, but in the Arctic regions they are very necessary for keeping up the heat of the body. The kind of food eaten also depends very often upon custom or habit, and sometimes upon religion. The Brahmins in many places will not touch meat. Mohammedans and Jews will not touch the flesh of pigs. Questions. What are the principal factors that determine the food habits of the human race? Give examples. B. How far can the people of one race change their food habits? C. Why are the foods of people in the same region often found to differ? Give examples. 40th. About this time, I, in brackets, Subhash Chandra, was brought face to face with the problems of untouchability. In a student's hostel, there was a Santhal student called Maji. The Santhals are generally looked upon as an inferior caste, but the students did not mind that, and Maji was welcomed as a boarder. Things went on all right for a time. One day, a personal servant of one of the boarders somehow came to know that Maji was a Santhal, and he tried to stir up trouble by calling upon the other servants to refuse to work in the hostel if Maji did not leave. Fortunately, nobody was in a mood to listen to his demand, and the trouble was nipped in the bud. What struck me at the time was that the really higher castes never so much thought of the case of the Santhal student, whereas the servant, who himself belonged to a comparatively low caste, appeared highly indignant, meaning angry. Questions. Who was Maji? B. What was the trouble about him? C. How was the trouble solved? D. How did it strike Subhash Chandra? 41. During the Industrial Revolution in Europe, everyone was so taken up with the wonder of machines turning out goods in huge quantities that no thought was spread for the poor workers. The factory owners was concerned only with his profit. Workers were very poorly paid and had to work long hours. They lived in a state of shocking poverty, and thousands died an early death. Later, things began to improve, and in all advanced countries there were new laws protecting workers' rights. It has also been realized that a man who is contented does much more work than a man who is not. So if a worker is given good wages and is treated fairly, it benefits the employer in the long run. Our government also is taking special care to see that the living and working condition of our workers are good and they get a fair deal. We have many laws protecting their rights. One deals with minimum wages, others help them in case of sickness or injury. Factories are inspected to see that the working condition of workers are good. New houses for workers are also built. Question. How was the factory workers treated at first? B. What is the attitude of factory owners towards workers now? C. What steps are being taken by our government to protect the rights of workers and improve their condition? 42. In ancient times, the good government of a country depended upon almost entirely on what sort of man was the king. If he was a man who wanted to see his people happy and prosperous, he could do a great deal for them by stopping quarrels and settling disputes justly, by making good roads and having the towns and villages kept clean, by building hospitals and schools, by making wells and tanks, and by allowing religious freedom. If, on the other hand, he was selfish, cruel, and greedy man, he could do a lot of harm by taking his people's goods, by making harsh laws and appointing bad officers, and by not having justice done. Page 698. But the people would usually put up with even a bad king, provided he did not interfere with their ordinary ways of earning a livelihood, with their religion and with their family affairs. It was only when the king was very bad, cruel, unjust and oppressive that the people tried to get rid of him. Questions. On what did the good government of a country depend in ancient times? B. How could a good king in those days make his people happy? C. How could a bad king do a lot of harm to people? D. How far did the people bear with a bad king? E. What happened when the king was very bad?